Hey look, I built a trash can.
Oh, we don't have time for your cockamamie inventions. We need that album review.
You know what? You're right. Imperial Triumphant, Goldstar. It's the end. Hello one, hello all, it's the gothiest ghost of them all, Casper in the flesh, and it's time for a review of Imperial Triumphant, Goldstar. This is the latest album from New York avant-garde metal project, Imperial Triumphant. And it's been quite a while since we've last heard from them, as their last project, Spiritual Ecstasy, which dropped in 2022, which is odd because it really feels like that album came out like more recent than it actually did, but I digress. And honestly, I felt that album was a continuation of the band's creativity, but in terms of production choice, I definitely found that album to be the weakest, because I didn't find it to be as decadent and as harrowing as Vile Luxury, or nowhere near as cinematic or dystopian and epic as Alphaville. Because with how powerful I found Alphaville to be and how well put together I found Alphaville to be, I really thought they hit their peak at this point. But after listening to this record numerous times, I was pleasantly proven wrong. And massively mistaken. Because this time around, they've certainly gotten way more wild, way more crushing than Alphaville, and I didn't even think that was possible. Because what they've done here is they've really expanded their sound. They've expanded the dissonant black metal, the dissonant death metal, and have thrown in inclusions of prog metal and continuation of jazz. And with Colin Marston being in the mix, I could honestly say this is truly one of his best mixes yet. And if you're a metal fan of the underground metal, you should be familiar with Colin Marston, as he has produced for Gorguts with Colored Sand. He is a member of Krallice, produced for Liturgy with Aesthetica, Panopticon. So you should definitely be familiar with the dynamics here. And the dynamics are done vastly well. And as far as the playing goes, there is no shortage of technical excellence here. And the vocals just sound like they're straight up out for blood. It's like the front man here, Zachary, is just a demon werewolf hybrid, just straight up out to savage, out to ravage, just out of his mind on this thing. Like, they're just straight up monstrous here, and the riffs are equally sinister. The rhythms have a lot of variety too, and the passages, man, the passages are just out of this world. Because as I've alluded to before with the expansion of what Alphaville has done, it is certainly a continuation here for sure, especially with the inclusions of tribal drums. And I would say they've even gotten more elaborate in that department. And I would say they even got more elaborate, more expansive than on Alphaville. And the sonic inclusions here are excellent. Like, there's even a epic horn shot that sounds straight out of the Star Wars soundtrack with the dun 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 dun. It's like the band really does strive thematically and sonically. Like, the aesthetics here, everything just keeps this thing alive and engaging. It really does feel like you're there. This is very this is very much a nightmarish, tangible experience. Sonically delivering to you futurism, dystopia. Also, I'm happy to announce they do not deprive us of the cool down moments that are much needed in the midst of all this chaos and torment. So the band is very much attentive to the album's flow, the album's sequencing. Like on Lexington Delirium, that sounds like the equivalent of country music made in a post-apocalyptic environment. Or on Industry of Misery, with its combination of reverb-soaked guitar, jazzy piano keys, or the absolutely sour synth chords at the end of Hotel SPHINX, which sounds something straight out of Clockwork Orange soundtrack, which what sounds like cultish children singing in the background with a bunch of fiery tremolos over them. And I gotta talk about New York City, which is honestly a short but vastly unhinged track. Maybe the most unhinged on the whole entire record, with a vocal appearance from Yoshika Ohara, which is no stranger to the Imperial Triumphant catalog. And not only no stranger to it, but also giving us the most disturbing, most freakish appearance, unforgettable appearance on a record yet. Because she is just giving out these elongated, bellowing, roaring screams, because as she roars throughout the track, we are getting these Yoko Ono-esque freakouts just echoing through the mix, just very sporadic, over this chugging wall of bass and speedy kicks, which is definitely a nice versatile change from Zachary's monstrous guttural growls, which we get a lot of on this record. Not saying they're bad or anything, they're not, I love them, but to create a nice vocal contrast is very rewarding. So upon listening to this record numerous times, I am definitely picking up on more layers here and more versatility and risks, just firing on all cylinders with a lot of ambition. Also, I feel like whenever they dish out something unhinged, they are also doing it with a lot of care and a lot of technical ability, not to a point where the thing sounds robotic and rigid and calculated. No, it definitely does sound like this is human made, not that AI shit. We're not talking about Sleep Token here. Because there's definitely a method to this mayhem here. Also, there's not really much in terms of goofiness here. Like, I didn't really find anything on this record to be too campy, too kooky, with the exception of one track, but we'll get into that one later. Because for the most part, this thing is very dense, very crushing, devastating, all within 38 minutes, 9 tracks. But I guess you could make the argument that there are 2 tracks here that are pretty interlude-ish, but I would say that New York really does have more ferocity going on here, definitely has more of a place in the album, and that's not to say that Goldstar doesn't, the title track, but it's not really a track though. It's more of, I would say, an interlude that really does feed into the narrative. But I will say though, it does call back to Alphaville in terms of the barbershop quartet vocals, singing a cigarette ad. And I do think it complements the album thematically, narratively, with the enslavement, consumerism, the capitalistic exploits. But again, I do wish it was connected to a song and opposed to being parsed out through the track list. But back to the sonic qualities here, because I want to say how, if you are familiar with these guys, the dizzying playing should be no surprise to you whatsoever. And you should also be familiar with how colossal and harrowing their playing could be. But while it is harrowing, it is also thrilling and exciting. But also, while harrowing, this thing could be thrilling and exciting even at the darkest points of the record. Especially with that thunderous double bass. And speaking of double bass, you know who's on this record? Legendary drummer of Slayer fame, Dave Lombardo, and also part of the avant-garde supergroup, Fantomas, who makes an appearance later on this album. And the funny thing is, there are points on this record where the guitar playing, the arpeggios are so fiery, they're so cycling, it's almost thrash coded, and I'm thinking to myself, they have got to have learned this from Slayer. And lo and behold, Dave is on this record. And with the Slayerisms that are on this album, I'm honestly thinking to myself, Dave Lombardo like heard this or heard something from them and said, hey man, look, if you're gonna have these Slayerisms, then I need to be on this record. And I'm not calling them Slayer copycats or anything like that. No, far from it. In fact, this is pretty much Slayer if they were more dystopian, more futuristic, post-apocalyptic, because while they do have their hellish elements, sure, they've never gone this, like, virtuous or this ambitious before. And not taking anything away from their early discography. It's a great discography. But the lengths and variations that this record goes, I don't think Slayer has ever gone. Especially when it comes to the composition and the structure. Especially when it comes to the compositions, the structures, which is very mind-bending, but also very gratifying. Because with this unpredictability, it's very unpredictable due to the fact that while there is structure here, the structure is phases, transitions, passages. And with these passages, these transitions, it's just one mind-blowing transition after the next. And there is a lot of consistency here because while you can say that, yes, structurally this does follow somewhat of a format, you can't say it sounds the same on every record because it doesn't, because they really do play with the dissonance here. They really do play with the atmosphere, and they really do play with how visceral things could get here. And while this record is dissonant and discordant, that doesn't take away from the fact that they do have harmonies here, they do have melodies here. Oh yeah, because with how punishing moments of this record could be, I feel like we get these harmonies as more of a treat, like, hey, here's a treat for all this torment and torture that you went through. In a good way, of course. Because what this record does is put you in the mindset and feeling of the victims, the characters that are in this album, the world that this band builds with this album, with how unnerving, how anxious, how insane that they probably feel. But you are noticing that there is a subservient attitude given to capitalism, to dictatorship. But it is pretty much what the people who are under this ruling, under these fascist guidelines should feel, is basically what the audience feels. Because there are notes here of cultism, persuasion, and right when the album kicks off with Eyes of Mars, you get these brief bits of distant jazz sax, ascending choral vocals, and the sad piano line that is just interrupted by this heavy set of gargantuan drums and guitar grooves that is just so abrasive, with these tremolos that are just searing that I feel if used as a weapon they could melt half of humanity. And I feel the track gets more and more and more overwhelming, disorienting, until it breaks into these swells of desolate drones. And with the drones and dissonant guitars, it really does give you a brief moment to catch your breath. And while you're catching your breath, you're hearing this female automated voice just giving you somewhat of these instructions or narrative. It's kind of hard to pinpoint what she's saying exactly due to the fact that there aren't any lyrics posted, but man, I can tell you right now it sounds ominous and fascistic. And after this break, you're just brought back, and after this break, you're just brought into this colossal hellscape. And I would say things get even more fiery on GOMORRAH NOVEAUX, that opens up with this highly unorthodox but intriguing combination of tribal percussion, with these lumbering rhythms I believe to be maybe hand claps, or it could be click sticks. I'm not necessarily sure. It's really hard to tell, but once I heard those wailing, dissonant chords, I knew I was in for some heat. As we're getting these throttling drums and bass, but it sounds like it's descending, like it's tumbling, this whole thing just sounds like the equivalent of just tumbling down a flight of stairs, but it's but plot twist, it's actually you tumbling down to the stairs of hell, because with these bass and drums working in tandem, they're working into a build-up, and then you're just greeted at the gates of hell. And the second half, you could argue, does have a similar groove to it, similar instrumentation. And while we do get the same combo, again, instrumentally, we're also getting these whirling, whipping-like sounds. I believe they're guitar slides, but they do appear again on this album on a few tracks. And with all this chaos, all this madness, it just comes to an absolute stop, the track just stops. And Lexington Delirium gives us a very well-deserved, really well-needed cool-down moment that I spoke on before, as it gives you a chance to just sit down, reflect on the very decimating circumstances of this world. And as the track opens up, you are getting a voice that basically tells you what you're thinking of these drastic societal changes, and then just gives you a vastly adrenaline-rushing burst of guitars. I do want to say, though, with how busy and claustrophobic the production could sound at times, The bass and the dissonant shots just sync up perfectly. But also there's moments where the dissonance and the chaos does contrast the bass very well. Because while the bass can be warm, there's also variation to where the bass could just be revving. Because while the bass can be warm and melodic, there is variation to a point where it just switches up and just becomes revving and discordant. There's certainly a lot going on here, and those sour guitar leads and blaring horns are just absolutely awe-inspiring through the midst of all this fiery, disastrous chaos. Like, it's awe-inspiring, but simultaneously fucking terrifying. And while it's not that long of a track, it certainly does leave an impact. And right when you think there's gonna be some sameness, some redundancy, boom, you're just hit with something to break up the monotony. I swear, when it comes to bringing something beautiful, terrifying, and versatile, like Imperial Triumphant is definitely one for the record books. And there is another drummer on here of legendary progressive metal band Meshuggah. I'm talking about Thomas Hake, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. But he does not drum here, no, he actually does narration. And honestly, he's a perfect fit for it, as the lyrics depict the disgusting mindset of a capitalist seeking plans of colonialism, gentrification, truly disgusting tyranny, and also kowtowing to oppression. And Hotel SPHINX probably has the most highest moments when it comes to fidelity here, definitely the most treble when it comes to the mixing. And the speedy tremolos, I feel, are a fantastic introduction into this very freaky and off-kilter passage. And it just goes from wild to grand to regal to just straight up abrasive and visceral, especially after the sour chord synth passage that I mentioned earlier. Like, this thing does not let you off easy. It actually reminds me somewhat of a callback to Lingua Ignota's Caligula album. Like, it's avant-garde, but absolutely pulverizing. And if I'm being honest, I could have gone without Rot Moderne, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. Probably not. Like, I think it's the weakest track here, a little too repetitive. And the bass here does come off a little goofy. I think it does run short of ideas. And I know I mentioned before that a majority of this is not goofy, but this is probably the goofiest, most kooky cut here. And it ends with a fade out. Really, guys? A fade out. However, I know I've alluded to PLEASUREDOME quite a couple of times. It was a single leading into this, but man, as a whole, this thing is very eccentric and crushing and a straight up monster, and probably one of my favorite tracks here. Well, definitely one of my favorite tracks here. And it really does have one of the most unique build-ups on the entire record. Like, we get these church bells, sirens, city sample bits of like the atmosphere, which is very Godspeed. And this track, I know I complained earlier about the other track fading out, but this track fades in. And honestly, I think we need more fade-ins to metal tracks. That's just me though. It's just me. But I really do think that adds more to the band's creativity here, in their creative wheelhouse. And this builds into a very zany syncopation of guitars and double bass drums. And the drums on this track are done by none other, as I mentioned before, Dave Lombardo. And the track has these chanted vocals that really does sound like he's chanting to a vast kingdom of people who have fallen for the cult. They're in the cult. As I mentioned before, this has this polyrhythmic hand percussion section that sound very tribal, but then go into this very jazzy, cabaret-esque passage. The whole thing sounds like an allure to like this ritualistic sacrifice. And I picture this woman do this erotic style dancing that's very hypnotic, very entrancing, to create this diversion, to get your mind off of the fact that you're being brainwashed and put into a cult. Like something beautiful and alluring as like a diversionary tactic. And looking into the lyrics, I am not too far off here. Because it definitely does. Because the lyrics definitely do depict this celebratory event as a diversionary tactic of domination leading to fascism, because there certainly is a diversion of getting people's attention away from the fact that there is a hidden agenda of a human sacrifice, but more globally, more societally, because what I'm picking up here is capitalism personified as like this god that people are looking up to, that this god has deceived you. And with the vocals being so chanted and people following, and this being like a group vocal type thing, this definitely does, I would say, symbolize the cult status mindset. And after this you get Industry of Misery, that has this very jazzy, curious intro that kind of reminds me of Twin Peaks a bit, but then it's just blasted away by these pounding, thrashing grooves of these blaring guitars. But man, the passages here sound so ghostly, so haunting, to these absolutely grotesque guitar swells that are so dissonant, with more chanted vocals of servitude to world enslavement, which isn't anything new thematically for Imperial Triumphant. They've certainly dove into this topic before, like on Alphaville. And with how chilling and how intense everything sounds here, there is somewhat a sense of stillness that I'm noticing here. But yet with the abrasiveness and destruction provided here, you could tell something egregious and horrifying is going on. But man, the friggin' ominous doomy soloing at the end of this track is such a dead ringer to the Beatles' She's So Heavy from the Abbey Road album. Except I would say with a more catastrophic, terrifying narrative. And the blazing guitar harmonies and embellishments are just so beautiful to me. Like, if the world was gonna end and this was the soundtrack, I would be content with that. I would be content with that. And the way this track ends is just so And I also gotta mention, with this spiraling effect of the production, I don't know how Colin did it, I don't know how they did it, but with the spiraling instrumentation here, it really does sound like there's like this portal, like this whirlpool of some kind. It's just sucking everything in from the instrumentation, such as the drums, the guitars. Like they're all being sucked into this portal. And then at the very end, you get this bright synth line. And then at the end you get this bright synth line that I would say is open for interpretation. It's pretty much however you perceive it. But certainly one of the best closers to a metal album I've heard this year, and definitely in the Imperial Triumphant catalog. Because Jesus, this really gives it the sense of finality, the sense of thematic closure, like the thematic sequential power that I was looking for all along with Imperial Triumphant. Not to take anything away from Alphaville or Vile Luxury, but they really did stick the landing here, and I'm really loving it. So overall, with the exception of a few tracks, I think the production here is fantastic. I think the playing is amazing. The performances provide a sense of terror, but also engagement and grooves and great technical ability. The writing I thought was fantastic, incredible, great structures, great variation, keeping it exciting, keeping it focused. And with how thematic it is, the flow of this, how suspenseful this is, how mesmerizing this is, how terrifying this is, it's like a friggin' movie. Very well done, and like I said before, I thought they peaked at Alphaville, but I was pleasantly surprised and satisfyingly wrong. I'm feeling a 4.5 out of 5 on this album, but if you've given this a listen, what did you think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? And that's it. Caspa, Gothic Ghost, Imperial Triumphant, Goldstar, till we meet again.